here. So first, cross-cultural communication, and then we will talk a little about the exam and what to expect and how to prepare for it. And so let me see if I can share the screen so you can see my slides here. So we will talk about cross-cultural communication. Fascinating topic. The challenge for me here was to condense all of the interesting things to 1 hour plus or minus. Normally, it would be several lectures just to cover this specific topic, but I chose the most interesting, the most relevant things, and then obviously you have a couple of readings assigned to you. Not a couple, I think it's 3 or 4 papers where you can get a little bit more information in a more sort of scientific way. I believe I told you a story about one of the airplane crashes where there was a problem with power distance between the pilots and the flight controllers. And here is another story also about a crash in Guam. So it was also Korean Air, an airplane that left from Seoul and had to make an emergency landing in Guam, the US territory, and crashed basically. And so the problem with this particular one was that there was a problem of communication between the pilot, the first pilot, and the second pilot. Again, the first pilot made a few mistakes. The second pilot and the engineer, flight engineer, they saw the problem. But again, because of the cultural norms and the way they communicate, they did not share their dissent or did not share their concern about the error that the captain made. And as a result, they all crashed without alerting the captain to the problem. So it could have been totally predicted and predictable or averted, but the communication problem led to this issue. And so let me talk here about a study that I did as, to open up the discussion. And I may even show you a couple of videos from this study, but this is one of the issues or one of the topics or one of the studies related to cross-cultural communication that is sort of doesn't deal with the language per se, because when we say cross-cultural communication, the challenge that comes to mind is always one of, well, people speak different languages. But the truth is that there are many more factors going on, or many more factors are at play when we're talking about cross-cultural communication. And I will just give you one of the examples of the studies that I did myself that consistently shows the results that sometimes, surprise even me, even though I've done it many times. I'm not going to do it as a study with you guys just because first, we don't have enough people to do it right. And second, because it would be a little bit kind of difficult to do as a part of the lecture. So let me talk about this study and then maybe show you a couple of the videos that I use here. So what I do for this illustration, and again, I stole the idea from a couple of professors in Canada who have done it in Montreal a few times. So, but what they do there is they have recordings of several different speakers who say more or less the same thing about a topic of the researcher's choice. So in my specific version of the study, what I did, I recruited 4 people to talk about common flu, the influenza virus. And so what I did was I literally copied, printed out the page from Wikipedia on influenza, on the virus. And I gave sort of like a paragraph summary or a couple of paragraph summary to my speakers. And I asked them to essentially repeat what they just read. And so in the end, all of them said more or less the same thing. So all of them said almost in the same wording, the same text. And so I would split the class in 4 sort of groups, and each of them would see a different recording, a different video. And so the students would then be asked to rate to what extent they believe the different speakers are credible or not credible in the topic. And so the difference, or let me show you, let me see if I can show you here on the screen a couple of examples. Like for example, this is one of the speakers that I use. Let me just see if I can move it to just a second. What I'll do, I'll stop sharing and then share a different screen so you can see the video. So for example, here is one of the speakers who talks about influenza, and you can see that she basically is reading the text. So So that's one of the speakers. Let me show you another one. And I'm not sure, I hope the sound was good enough so you can hear her. But anyway, so here's another one.
Yeah, boss, we couldn't hear that.
You couldn't hear? Let's see if this one will be louder. So hopefully it will be, you can see the picture with the man in the eyeglasses, right? So you see the screen. So let's hope that this will be a little bit better.
Influenza, commonly known as the flu, is an infectious disease of birds and mammals caused by viruses. The name influenza comes from the Italian. Influenza, meaning influence.
Could you hear that? To some extent, right? You got the idea. And then there is one more, I'll show you one more video. For example, this lady here.
Influenza comes from the Italian name influenza, which means influence. The common symptoms are chills, fever, general discomfort, weaknesses, severe headache, muscle pain.
So, and so on. So you would have different people and they make more or less the same statement, but the students wouldn't, or the participants in the study wouldn't see all of them, they see one at a time. And so normally I would try to have about up to 20 people in each category. And then I ask those students, those people who watch the video, rate to which extent they believe the person is knowledgeable about the topic. So the person who is doing the presentation, how knowledgeable, how much expertise the person has on the topic. And so just like in the study before me, the one that I sort of copied here for my illustration purposes, there is also always basically the same. So the people who speak better language, who are native speakers, and especially if you add eyeglasses, you saw I had 6 pictures actually there. And so one of the speakers was in one condition with eyeglasses and in the other one without the eyeglasses. So they would be getting the highest expertise ratings, especially when they have the eyeglasses on. People who speak with a heavy, thick accent, they usually would be perceived as less knowledgeable, as lesser experts on the topic. Even though the message is the same, the text is the same. And so the point here is that sometimes these kinds of things matter. What's ironic in this particular illustration that I use, that the lady who speaks with a very strong accent, she's from Iran, she's actually a medical doctor. So she all her life, she worked as a medical doctor. She held also some administrative positions at a hospital and then decided to do a PhD in management and went back to school. And so she was one of my classmates. So I recorded her as well. So of all the people, she actually was the most knowledgeable because that's her profession, but she consistently got the lowest ratings because, the way she speaks. And so one of the things we will be discussing today is how the fluency of your fluency in the working language can affect how you're perceived by your team members. So it would be part of the cross-cultural communication, but again, in this case, it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that, that people may be speaking different languages. In this case, they speak the same language, but those some of those sort of underwater currents potentially can influence how the dynamics of the team develops. So let me go back to my slides here and continue talking about some of the things. And so before we get into all of the cross-cultural communication theory, I will give you a couple of illustrations that sort of I came up with, and to be honest, didn't fully test, but this is my explanation and my understanding why cross-cultural communication becomes difficult. And the reason for that is, again, I'm here speculating to some extent. I'm not a neurobiologist or neurologist, but I believe that the challenges and the reasons we often miscommunicate or have misunderstandings when we talk to people from different cultures is that the way our brain has evolved, essentially. Let me just see, am I recording the meeting? Yes, I am recording, wonderful. So the way the brain has evolved is it sort of developed this wonderful propensity to look at the background and the context and to fill in the blanks in a sense as it's forming the understanding of the situation for us. And so usually that works very well. Usually our brain's ability to look at the big picture and take everything available to it to convey the meaning, it helps a lot. It allows us to very efficiently process the information, to look quickly at the situation and know exactly what's going on. The problem is then when you have a cross-cultural context, sometimes the big picture may be not really misleading, but the way we can look at the background and interpret it can distort the message. And I know it didn't make sense to you what I just said, so let me do a few illustrations. So let me show you how our brain uses the context and the background and the big picture to help us make judgments about different things. And I will specifically show you a few examples where the brain tricks you, basically misleads you. Like, for example, this is an ages-old riddle, which you probably have seen many times. If I ask you which of the orange dots is bigger, which one of the two would be bigger, the one on the left or the one on the right? So raise your hand if you believe that the one on the left is bigger. Raise your hand if you believe that the one on the right is bigger. Nobody raise your hands because you know that the two dots are the same size. But even though you know that, admit that the one on the right looks bigger to you, right? I mean, even though I know, it still looks bigger to me. And no, they are the same. So if I do this little animation here, let me see if it's working here. I guess my animation is messed up a little bit. Yeah, no, it's fine. So you can see that the size is exactly the same. But our brain tricks us into believing that the one on the right is bigger because it takes the background into account, and those smaller dots are in the background make it look bigger. So our brain, in an attempt to help us judge size by using the background incorrectly, essentially, can trick us into misjudging the size of an object. Here is a similar illustration. So this one asks you, which of the two, basically what color is the quadrant A? Can anyone tell me? So what color is this cell A? Most of you probably see it as kind of dark gray, right? Or maybe black. And then what color is the cell labeled B? Again, most of you probably see it as white. Now the truth is that they are the same color. So again, if my animation will work here, let me just move it away from the background. So as you can see, they are exactly the same color. So I literally cut it out. And so once I remove the background, once I put them both against the white background, you can see that they exactly the same color, and that is kind of grayish. But when I show it on the picture, your brain makes the assumption that there is a shadow here, and it sees the same color a little bit brighter because it tries to help you. It's trying to help you to adjust for that shadow, and it's trying to adjust the color in your mind. So even though we know that it's exactly the same color, when we look at the picture, we are allowing the brain to mislead us because the brain is taking that background information and misinterpreting that. So the brain doesn't know how to deal with that. And so it makes a mistake of telling us that the two colors are different, even though they are the same. So the background information sometimes can be harmful in a sense, or misleading, because it makes our brain to misjudge, for example, the color of the object. Here is another illustration. So if you can see this cell on the top of the upper, in the middle of the upper face, if I ask you what color that is, most of you probably would say that it's basically brown, right? And then when I show you this one facing, the face that is facing us in the middle, most of you would see it as yellow. But again, if I kind of cut it out and move it to the, white area, we see that it's the same color. So we understand that in this case too, the background is sort of misleading. So the brain is trying to use that shadow information or information about the possible shadow and adjust the colors so that we can make correct judgment. And in this case, again, it makes us misjudge our, judgment about the color. This one, I'm not sure if it's gonna work on the screen here, so I haven't done it before. But if you look at that little cross in the middle, so tell me what you see. Just focus on it and tell me what you see. And if you are like me, and if the message is transmitted well through this Zoom, hopefully the quality is good enough, what happens when you look at this picture is first you start seeing a green dot that is moving clockwise. And then if you look hard enough, then the dot disappears and all of the dots around the picture disappear and you only see the black, cross in the middle. So if you try to focus on it, you will see the green dot and then nothing but the green dot, and the pink dots kind of disappear. Again, the truth is that there is no green dot. So all those pink dots, they just switch off one by one. But somehow our brain turns that into a sort of a negative. And so the pink, the opposite color is green. So it creates the green dot. But then it kind of figures that it's not important because you're focusing on the middle, and it tells you that there are no dots at all. Again, this is a useful thing normally when you're sort of, in your usual environment, maybe hunting for your, I don't know, evening dinner. But it is sort of distorting the information, trying to help you make sense of the world around you. You probably have seen this one many times, right? So the two lines look like, bend lines, so they don't look like straight lines to you. They probably look like, concave or whatever the wording here is, so that they're a little bent. But again, if I remove the background, you will see that they're perfectly straight. And again, the background here is essentially not helping, but making you think that, essentially distorts your sense of direction. You don't think that the lines are straight. It makes you think that they are a little curved. And in reality, they are straight. Same thing here. So looking at the direction, when you look at the lines, if I ask you what you see on this picture, you probably would say that you see some sort of zigzags. But again, when I remove the background, you will see that these are perfectly parallel lines. And so the way they are kind of drawn makes you think that it's a zigzag. But again, once I kind of cut it down, you see that these are straight parallel lines. How about this one? You may have not seen this one. What is the shape of the green table? Can you name that shape?
Rectangle.
Rectangular, okay. How about the red one?
Square.
Squares. So in reality, they are exactly the same shape. So if both of them rectangular. So if you measure the length of the blue line and the yellow line, they're precisely the same. But the way these tables are drawn, so essentially it's flipped 90 degrees. But the way the tables are drawn, it sort of makes you think that they are different shapes. Again, if you want to play with like a ruler, you can literally do that on the recording, and you will be surprised that they are, yellow lines are precisely the same distance, and the blue lines are precisely the same distance. So geometrically speaking, that's exactly the same shape. But again, it's misleading about the shape of the object in this case, and your brain is trying to help you here and essentially tricks you into believing something that is not. Or this one, again, looks like a bunch of spirals, right? So, but if I remove the background, you will see that these are perfectly nice concentrical circles. So exactly the same, but again, your brain sort of, misleads you. Let's do one more and then we'll talk about communication. How about this one? Those of you who believe that line A is longer, raise your hand. Those of you who believe that line B is longer, raise your hand. Those of you who believe that both lines are the same distance, the same length, raise your hand. And I tricked you. The line A is longer, but I gave you enough background when I was showing you something that was not, and you made the assumption that that's another, one of my tricks. Even though your brain was telling you that line A is longer, you didn't believe it anymore because you've been primed over the last several exercises. So they are, different. I'll show you one more, and again, I hope it will work, but if not, I have a link here to the actual video. And so let me see if it's going to work. This one is a fascinating illustration of how your brain distorts sound. So let me see if it's going to work. So tell me if the sound is bad, and then I'll just let you watch it later on, but let's see if it's going to work.
Have become quick to catch illusions that trick our eyes, but how often do you consider illusions of the ear? Are you really able to trust your ears and the things they hear? For example, listen to Greg speaking.
Bar, 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 bar.
What do you hear? If you heard bar, 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 you'd be right. But how about now?
Bar, 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 bar.
Chances are you heard far, far, far this time with an F, except you didn't. In fact, the audio didn't even change between the two videos.
Bar, bar, bar.
Strange as it may seem, what you hear depends on which video you're looking at. Go ahead, take turns watching each video and see how the sound morphs.
Bar, bar, bar.
This is a perfect example of something called the McGurk effect, which shows how our visuals can alter what we believe we're hearing. Now I want you to count how many times you see a circle flash on screen. Let's do that one more time.
You can watch the rest of the video. You have the link in both the slides, and I think I added it to the collection of the readings, or to the module there. But again, the point here is that sometimes our brain is trying to make an assumption about what you hear based on what you see. And as you saw in this illustration, I hope the sound was good enough. that when you look at the video of the man sort of, saying the F sound, you hear far, 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 even though the actual video is, the actual sound is bar, bar, bar. That's probably one of the reasons why it's so difficult to teach in a mask, especially if you speak with an accent, as I do. Because again, much of the information is transmitted through the eyes. Much of the audio information is sort of caught by the eyes. And so obviously that makes it much more difficult to understand a person if you don't see the lips. So, but again, sometimes it can be counterproductive. And so what I was trying to say here is that cross-cultural communication is to a large extent like what you saw now here. So what happens is your brain is trying to look at the whole picture, at the way the person behaves, at the way the person is dressed, at maybe the place where the meeting is taking place, and use that information to help you better understand what is being said. And the problem is that in different cultures, we use different cues to convey the message, or maybe different contexts, or same context may mean different things. We will be talking, for example, about some of the nonverbal communication. So where different gestures, where the same gesture may mean different things in different cultures. Or perhaps, some of the messages that are being sent in some cultures through nonverbal communication are not perceived by another culture because in, for example, the United States, that, gesture or that move or that mimic, it doesn't mean, that expression, facial expression may not mean anything at all. And so the problem here is that when we move to a different country, we may be paying attention to the same cues and same context and interpreting it the same way we would interpret it in our culture. But maybe over there, it means something completely different. And so that's where the challenge is. Like, for example, another study I do sometimes with my students, again, when there are enough of them in the same classroom, I would show 2 videos of people, again, talking about influenza, but one person would be talking fast and one person would be talking slowly. And so what's interesting that depending on where the person comes from, the person can interpret the proficiency or expertise differently depending on the speed of on the pace of the speech. For example, in the United States, and especially in Latin American and Mediterranean cultures, the faster the person speaks, the more expertise the person is attributed. And so usually, I guess probably the logic is, oh, he speaks about it so fast, so he knows it really well, so he can talk about it really fast. But then in some other cultures, like for example, in South Korean culture, it's the opposite. So people who speak slowly are attributed more expertise. And again, I don't know why I'm speculating here. Maybe, they think, oh, the person is so relaxed and so confident. And because of that, it tells me that the person is really knowledgeable on the topic. So same person saying the same things at different speed may be perceived as sort of a good thing or a bad thing by people from different cultures. And so when you have someone who is used to, for example, speaking fast to communicate your sort of expertise and knowledge of the topic, you take that same person with the same speech pattern to a different culture, and all of a sudden everybody will think that the person is not knowledgeable because it's all blah, 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 blah fast, the person doesn't really, care, or I don't even know what it would be interpreted. So same thing, but it would be interpreted differently in different cultures. So let's talk more about kind of some theoretical stuff and then get into more examples of communication differences in different cultures. So here is one of the models of communication styles that are believed to be different in different countries. So this one is from Lewis. There is a book, When Cultures Collide. And so that's from that book, but you can see replications of this study or of this model in multiple publications. And so according to this model, there are 3 main communication styles. So you have linear active. So basically it's a direct style, cold in a sense that emotions are not really, expressed very actively, focused on the facts, effects, and data. So essentially in these cultures, what people say is what they want to say, or the words convey the actual meaning. But then you can have, for example, multi-active style. So this red circle on the top. And so this would be the style that is characterized by very emotional speaking. So very warm, very expressive, where, dialogue is common and people almost sometimes talk one over the other. And then you have the third type, which we call reactive. And so this is more a style where people are very courteous, they, you know, take turns, they accommodate, they listen more, so they try to be as respectful as possible. And so the United States, according to this study, and they looked at data, collected data and speech patterns in all kinds of countries. As you can see here, we have about 20, 30 countries on this diagram. So the United States, Germany, UK, Switzerland, sort of kind of Western countries, whatever that is. So in this cluster, the linear active style is predominant, meaning that when we talk to one another, we primarily pay attention to the actual words. So in fact, maybe that's the reason why American contracts are so detailed. So there is always a lot of fine print and a lot of definitions and a lot of text, because this is how we convey the message. But if you go to some Latin American cultures, or perhaps maybe some Middle Eastern cultures, so they tend to be much more expressive and much more emotional in their communication. And so the words themselves may be a little bit less important. It's more about how people talk. And maybe that's the reason, again, they're not very keen on contracts. So the handshake and how much you respect and like the person matters more than what's in the actual contract, because the words are not as important there. And then sort of the Asian communication styles are more courteous. So being polite, being respectful, not saying no, not, you know, contradicting your you know, opponent. So it's being a little bit more, you know, accommodating in this respect. And again, so those would be sort of Asian cultures. How true or accurate those ratings are still today, probably to some extent they're still true, and I haven't done studies in this area, so I can believe what my colleagues have done here. But one interesting extension of this model is that when you look at sort of who can work with whom relatively easily, so we see that, for example, people, let's say from, you know, the United States and from, let's say, you know, Mediterranean or Middle Eastern or Latin American cultures, sometimes communication may be difficult because they're sort of at a different, you know, pace and speed and wavelength. But then, you know, when you take someone from, let's say, Latin America and someone from Asia, then again, interaction becomes time consuming. So again, it becomes a little bit more difficult to interpret messages, and it takes some time. But then when you take someone from, let's say, the United States and Japan, apparently communication will be not easy, but satisfactory. So might work just fine. Again, so an interesting model. You don't need to know all of them, but for the exam, I will ask you about sort of the main sort of components of this model, or which of the clusters the United States would fall in, for example. Direct-Indirect, Explicit-Implicit type of communication styles. Again, this one is from Harry Triandas's book, and this one sort of shows graphically how people get to the point. Again, so what they call, or he calls, the English communication style, or American in this case would be also the same. You kind of get directly to the point. But when you go to, for example, Oriental communication style, they will be kind of going in circles and never telling you exactly what they mean. So it would be beating all around the bush. Again, I'm not sure how accurate and universal these ratings are. And, you know, is everyone in the United States direct, and is everyone in the Oriental world indirect? Hard to say, but at the very least, you know, it gives you another illustration of what the possible styles could be. So some people sort of, you know, so different communications. And so here is, for example, a joke that I'm not sure if you see it, but they're very popular among immigrants. So immigrants always make fun of Americans, where Americans sometimes, you know, have a way to say things that, you know, other people are not necessarily interpreting the same way. So same words, but it means something different. So for example, when Americans, I'll give you another example that you probably see, but you can read these if you want. Like when you ask an American, how are you doing? So in most of the cases, Americans would say something like fantastic or awesome. But what it means is, thank you very much for asking, essentially. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't even mean that I'm fine. It just means thanks for asking. But in some other cultures, people are like, oh, she's doing really well. Okay, that's good. So, so sometimes there are some differences of that kind. And so, you know, maybe when criticizing, Americans have, you know, creative ways of disguising sort of criticism in a way that is more encouraging. Whereas maybe some other people may be a little bit more, you know, direct in their criticism perhaps, or maybe, you know, not as diplomatic. So, but anyway, the point here is not so much that this is what Americans are like or whatever other country, but just to show you some of the dimensions or some of the ways to think about those differences. So when we talk about communication, verbal, you know, words, obviously one thing that comes to mind is language differences. And we talked about that, but I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. I talked a little bit about the speech pace. Again, the pace at which the person is talking may affect how people judge the person's credibility and trustworthiness. And again, this is something that is hard to change. So for example, I've been in the United States for who knows how long, and I speak faster than the normal pace for this culture. So it almost seems like it's impossible to change for me because that's what I'm used to from my background. Interruption rate may be very different in different cultures. Again, in some countries, it's unthought of that people would be interrupting one another. And in others, people may be talking at the same time, and that's the normal way to communicate. So that would be, a very common thing. But again, when we go back to languages, sometimes, in fact, I've seen a study, I saw a study that showed that similar languages sometimes lead to more confusion than completely different languages. That particular study looked at some sort of United Nations or some sort of, Peace Corps, not Peace Corps as the Peace Corps, but the peacekeeping armed forces stationed somewhere, if I remember correctly, in Africa. And so what those researchers did, they recorded the meetings of the officers, international, basically from different countries, and then tried to quantify the number of times there was a misunderstanding in the communication. And what they found was that there was more misunderstanding between countries that come from similar language groups than when the language groups are completely different. And I'll give you a couple of examples here and then show a funny video that sort of explains that, in a more fun way. Like, for example, when the languages are completely different and you say something and I don't know what it is, I know that I don't know and I don't make any assumptions. But when the languages are similar, sometimes the word may sound the same way, maybe even be spelled the same way, but it means a different thing. And I may not even realize that I misunderstood you. And so if it's something like mist, for example, so in German, anybody speaks German here? Anybody knows what mist means in German? So spelled the same way as in English, pronounced the same way as in English, but in English, mist means haze, fog, you know what mist means, right? But in German, it means literally shit, so manure. So, I guess here it's a little bit, the difference in meaning is so different that you can spot it right away from the context. But when you look, for example, at actually, so which is in English, actually, in reality, but in French, spelled kind of the same way, pronounced similarly. I think it's actually pronounced as actually or something like that, but it means presently at this specific time. And so that's a little difference in meaning, not always easy to spot from the context, but different enough to mean different things. And so when you speak to someone from France, you may hear that word and you may assume that you understood what it means, but in reality, it may mean actually something different. And so let me see here if I can show you this video. I went to a different, just a second. So there is a funny video that sort of illustrates how a similar word sometimes may be problematic. So let me just share the different screen so you can see it. And you will see this video here. Hopefully the sound will be good enough.
Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das bedeutet das Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So I'm not sure if you were able to hear that. So, but the problem there was that the two similar words, we are sinking, mayday, mayday. What are you thinking about? So again, sometimes similarity in meaning may actually lead to more confusion than help. Likewise, again, you probably know a lot of words that are similar, that are different in British versus American English. So when you say something or hear something like, I live in a block of flats, you can probably guess what that means, right? Block of flats, anyone what it is? I guess you understand that it's an apartment building essentially, right? But for example, some things make no sense. Like, did you know that the word billion has a different meaning in English versus American English versus British English? So in the United States, a billion is 9 zeros basically, right? But in all of Europe or most of Europe, a billion is 12 zeros. And 12 zeros in the United States is a trillion. And so if you happen to be an accountant and you use the word billion, if you don't know that it has a different meaning in different countries, you may be in a lot of trouble because, you know, the numbers are named differently. So in Europe, they call one with 9 zeros, they call it a milliard. And so here we call it a billion. And then we use trillion for 12 zeros, but they use billion for 12 zeros, and go figure. Football, you know, soccer, we know that, but there are a bunch of other, you know, words where, you know, there is a problem and there is a, you know, difference in meaning. For example, college in the United States, it's sort of the first 4 years of the university, but in many countries, there is a big difference between the word college and university in general. So numbers, you would think that in different countries, we use the same numbers. I had to learn it a hard way. In 2001, I started my master's studies at the University of Texas in Dallas. And my very first exam was in statistics, Professor Jargowski. And so I was using my European numbers. It was at that time we still were using, you know, basically paper-based exams. And I was writing my numbers in European numbers, and I lost points because the professor misread my numbers. So let me give you here a few examples and you tell me which number that is. Let me see if you can see my screen here. You know what, let me move it faster. So if I wrote a number like this, what number is this here, if you can see it? Anyone? Let me do it differently. Let me share. Yeah, I guess I need to show you. Yeah,
Share your screen and we can see it better.
Yeah, let me do it on the screen here, shared screen. So American 1 looks like American, you know, like one line. In all of Europe and all of Asia, 1 looks like an American 7. And so your interpretation of 1 would actually be 7. That's what happened to me. So my 1 was interpreted by the professor as 7. Sometimes in Germany, for example, 1 actually has this longer kind of hook than the 1 itself. And so 1 and 7 is a common problem, common confusion. Now, European 7 has this sort of, you know, cross out thing. So American 7 is more like an inverted L letter. European 7 always has this, you know, has that extra cross, and that's why they never confuse it. Actually, let me unshare the screen and let me do it for real. So this number, again, most of you would interpret that this here is most of you will think that it's a 7, but in Europe that definitely would be a 1. How about this number? What number is this here? Anyone? Can you see it?
6.
So most of you will think that it's 6, but in Europe and Asia, it's actually 4, because their 6 will have the hook on top of that, and their 4 is like that, and your 4 is like this. So they write like the quick 4 in Europe and Asia is like this. And so sometimes when this loop becomes a little bit bigger, it looks more like 6 to you. So let me see if I have any other numbers. For example, what symbol is this here? And the light is not very good, but what symbol is this? So most of you probably would think that it's a G, but in reality, it's a 9 in all of the world, because American 9 is like this, but everywhere else, it does have the hook. And so to you, it looks more like a G. And so again, in different countries, people write numbers differently. Nowhere else in the world, people cross the 0. So in the United States and Canada, sometimes people cross the 0, and nowhere else people do it. Which ones are accurate or correct? I don't know, but do you know where the numbers come from? Do you know why there is a difference? I guess it's not exactly cross-cultural communication, but I'll spend a minute on that. So the original sort of numbers come from the number of angles in the way the Arabs wrote the numbers. So 1 was 1 because it has 1 angle. 2 was written like this, it has 1, 2. 3, 1, 2, 3. 4, let me go to 4. 4 was written like this. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 was written like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 was written like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 has that cross because you needed to get the 7 angle, so you needed to get to, it was actually like this. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 was like this. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I think it was like this, 9. And then 0 was just a round number because it has zero angles, it's just a circle. And so over time, obviously, they morphed a little bit, and now it creates some confusion when people look at the numbers. So let me go back to my slide. So here you have some of the examples of how the numbers can be written differently. So language also may affect how people act and think and behave. In fact, a bunch of studies have shown that when bilinguals change from one language to another, they literally change sometimes their, different, behaviors and patterns and values. And we talked about some of that stuff. But for example, interruption. So in some languages, like for example, English or many European languages, the important stuff is at the beginning. And so when I say I went to school, you say I went, and so you know immediately who is doing the action and what is being done. But in some other languages, the important stuff comes at the end. So for example, German is one of those languages. So in German, when you say, you went to school, and then you want to add, alone, on Monday, all other kinds of modifiers here, you would say ich bin, so basically, which means I am. Then you add all that junk, gestern, yesterday, allein, alone, all that stuff. And only then at the end, you would say gegangen, which is basically the word for past tense of going. And so until you hear the whole sentence, you wouldn't know what they said because the most important word actually comes last. And so the studies, sure enough, have shown that Germans are less likely to interrupt each other. And they believe that that's, the propensity is caused by the, by the habit to listening to the end, because otherwise you wouldn't understand the meaning. So, and you have a couple of studies there that talk about, in your readings that talk about this stuff. Cross-cultural, nonverbal communication. So same gestures may mean different things in different languages. In fact, here on screen, so I got this book as a gift one time from one of my students, and the book is called Don't Get Me Wrong, and it's literally the gestures and their different meaning in different countries. And they have a bunch of things like, for example, this number means 8 in China. Did you know that? I guess in the United States, that may mean, I don't know, like a pistol or something, a gun. So let me open a couple of other things. So this one, China, Sudan, and the United States means stop. I guess that's kind of makes sense to you. But for example, this symbol here, so in Russian and Ukrainian, that's basically a middle finger. But in Netherlands and Turkey, it means, oh yeah, it is a vulgar symbol, middle finger essentially, yeah. And so on. So Australia, Hawaii, you know what this means, right? So everything's fine, take it easy. So, but anyway, a very interesting book of collection of kind of, gestures that mean different things in different languages. Let me show you a couple more examples. So I included a couple of videos for you, and I will put them in the modules there. So where you have a collection of how different gestures can be interpreted differently in different countries. And so here you have a collection of different things, different, nonverbal signs that literally mean very different things in different cultures. I'm not going to spend time on it now, but you can watch them later, so in high definition. But for example, this one is my favorite. So in the United States, let me see, is it working? For some reason, yeah, okay. Hopefully it's working on your screen. So when you nod your head, in most of the world, it means yes. And when you shake your head, in most of the world, it means no. But in Bulgaria and Albania, it's the opposite. And when I first heard that, I didn't believe it, but we actually have a professor from Bulgaria who did confirm that yes, in Bulgaria, this is no, and this is yes. And he says when he goes and visits his family, it literally takes him a little time before you get used to it, and then you switch back to the mental model. So, but these things are still relatively easy because, you kind of over time, you learn them. Sometimes when it comes to cross-cultural communication, some things are sort of, not easily spottable, let me put it this way. For example, the way you look can make you look very different. And because of that, in many cases, very uncomfortable. not to mention that there may be some stereotypes associated with, you know, the person's appearance and the person's, you know, qualities or properties or, you know, characteristics. And so sometimes, you know, when you have cross-cultural communication, you may have that different, you know, appearance, different look. And so as a result, people may, you know, treat each other or interpret each other differently. So in fact, that's been known for a long, long time. In fact, even in The Little Prince by Exupéry, I remember there was a scene there about a guy who had some sort of an invention, but he was from the Middle East or from India, and nobody would listen to him because he didn't look like a scientist. And so next year he came back to the conference, this time dressed in a suit and a tie, and all of a sudden everybody was interested in his invention, something like that. And so again, little thing, but you know, when you come from a different country, you often do look differently, and people may make assumptions about you based on your appearance and not based on what you have to say. Language proficiency, we talked about that. Status is attributed differently based on where you come from, like it or not, but a lot of studies have shown that people who sort of come and appear to be from a developing country, they would be attributed less expertise or less knowledge or less, you know, proficiency in the topic because, you know, how can you know something about engineering when your country doesn't even have running water, for example, right? And so a lot of studies have shown that it's just a bias. And again, in this case, by the way, don't think that I'm criticizing people from the rich countries. Studies have been conducted with all kinds of audiences, and they say that often the people from the sort of poor countries discriminate even more than people from the rich countries. So it has nothing to do with, you know, our, you know, biases or rich people disrespecting the poor people. It is something that we sort of, you know, grew up to use to make judgments about people, and in many cases they may be misleading, but in many they are correct, and so that's why our brain kind of keeps making those judgments, and in many cases it leads to problems. I'll tell you a story from my own childhood, or not childhood, my youth years, and it almost sounds horrible, and I don't think I would be doing it today, but in the 90s I must have saved or made definitely in tens of thousands, I don't know how many, you know, dollars. But I was using, at that time, by the way, I didn't know that it's part of a study, you know, later I saw studies that show it. But at that time, so in 1993 and 1994, I was studying in Germany as a high school student. And then when I came back to Ukraine for a while, I had this business where I was buying and selling cars. So I was buying cars in Germany and then selling them in Ukraine. When the Soviet Union had collapsed, everybody understood that Soviet cars are not good. And so everybody wanted to buy cars from the West. And it was a very lucrative business to go to Germany, for example, buy a used car and then resell it in Ukraine. And so the cars we bought were not expensive. So we're talking about maybe $5,000 to $10,000, probably even less than that in most of the cases. But again, you could make, you know, a few $100s on each transaction, which at that time was a huge amount of money in Ukraine. And so what I noticed was that depending on which language I use, it made it sort of easier or more difficult to negotiate with German traders, car dealers. So my German at that time was very good, probably as good and maybe even better as my English is now. So I spoke with an accent, but I was pretty fluent. My English at that time was not as good as my German, but importantly, my English was better than that of German car salesmen. And so I noticed that when I was speaking to them in German, I was sort of automatically attributed lower status. I would be arguing that this car is worth only, let's say, $7,000, and they would be saying, no, it's worth $9,000. And because I cannot easily express myself, you know, I speak with an accent, I may not know enough, you know, vocabulary. So they were sort of, you know, in that conversation, subconsciously, they appeared as a more knowledgeable person. But I noticed if I insist on speaking English, so if I pretend that I cannot speak German, my English was much better than that of most German car salesmen. And all of a sudden the dynamics changes. All of a sudden I'm the one who's speaking more fluently. And again, it's a horrible thing to admit, but I literally would pretend that I do not understand them. I would say, yeah, what did you say? Can you repeat that again? And the guy would kind of, you know, feel uncomfortable, and the guy would feel like, you know, like try to repeat. And so my estimate is that I would probably get an additional 10% discount just because I put them in that uncomfortable situation. As the, you know, the Chinese, whatever philosopher, the art of war said, you know, fight when you're on the horse and your opponent is dismounted. So I basically would put myself on the horse by choosing the language where I'm more fluent. And again, I don't know if it's ethical. As I said, I probably wouldn't play those games now. But if you happen to be bilingual, for example, and maybe in some cases, well, I guess for you, you don't really need to play the games because most likely the language will be English. And you are obviously fluent. You know, all of you, I assume, are native English speakers. So automatically you get that advantage, like it or not. And so again, much of this stuff is completely subconscious. It's not that somebody is saying that, you know, Americans are better or, you know, it's just because we judge people by the quality of their language. Because usually smart people, you know, have better quality language. And, you know, kids may be sometimes, you know, saying wrong things because they still haven't learned the language and they're still developing. And so we automatically, subconsciously attribute sort of expertise and knowledge and status based on the quality of language. And in cross-cultural situations, sometimes they may not necessarily convey, you know, meaning. But, you know, all our life, people who couldn't speak were either dumb or children. And so our brain keeps telling us the same thing. And so for that reason, as I said, sometimes the judgments are made the wrong way. All right, let's do a couple more examples. And so when people speak in a foreign language, as I said, they make mistakes. Sometimes they speak simpler language, perhaps not as engaging as otherwise, maybe have a tendency to over-explain. And so as a result, sometimes they may appear as, you know, basically that's the speech pattern of, let's say, a kid or maybe someone who is not very smart. And so sometimes that unfortunately may, you know, lead to communication difficulties. There is another model, one of the oldest models of communication that is called high-low context communication. So the original model was introduced in 1960 by Edward Hall. And so here he said that in some cultures, the context doesn't matter that much. It's all about the words that people say. So if you say yes, it means yes. If you say no, it means no. In other cultures, it's more about context, kind of similar to that triangle. So when we look at those other two models. So it's not about what you say, it's about the context. So the true meaning, like for example, so will you get the contract or not? Will you get the job or not? Are you fired or not? The true meaning is not in what the boss told you, but rather who was present at the meeting, how long was the meeting, where the meeting took place, where at the table you were seated. So things like that, in many cases, may mean much more. So they will never tell you a no, but from those cues, from that context, you may be able to judge, so are you going to get that contract or not? And so again, sometimes that leads to communication and, you know, misinterpretation of the messages. Again, there is another kind of short funny video from the movie called Mr. Baseball. Again, the quality probably will not be very good when I share the screen, but I will put that video in the optional videos and readings for you. And you can watch this one. Kind of happens, a misunderstanding happens during the dinner, I guess in this time, or lunch in Japan. So the American guy behaves as he would in the United States, and in Japan, obviously that sends their own message and leads to a little tension and confusion in that specific situation. All right, a couple more studies on culture and communication. So this one, again, is from one of the studies that I was a co-author of. So what we did, it was a meta-analysis, and we found 60 papers that looked at the relationship between cultural values. Remember a couple of lectures ago, we talked about culture. So like individualism, collectivism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, femininity. So those are the things that we looked at, and we wanted to see if they correlate with any of the communication patterns. Like, for example, directness, or perhaps a propensity to maybe mislead each other, or maybe be not entirely truthful, things like that. And so you can read the paper, it's in your optional readings, and the tables kind of look like this. So it's a lot of numbers and not always easy to interpret what they mean. So here is, for example, a summary of the findings for individualism. And so we had much less data for power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and masculinity, femininity. So I will not be providing them here in the slides. You can read them in the paper. But for individualism, collectivism, what we found, or rather what those 60 papers found and we summarized, was that people from cultures that are high on individualism, like, for example, the United States or Canada, so they tend to be a little bit more direct when they communicate. They tend to be more self-promoting. So they use more self-promotion in communication. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. They are less concerned about face saving. So again, in Asia especially, there is this concept of saving the face. So you always try to communicate in a way that the other party can save their face. They do not look embarrassing or do not look in unfavorable light. So that concept is less important here in the United States. They tend to be a little bit more open, a little bit more likely to interrupt, more likely to invade personal space. So again, in some cultures, people keep much greater distance. The United States actually in that respect is a little bit more kind of on average, because there are some countries that are even closer, like when you go to some European or Middle Eastern countries, you really feel like they are right in your face. But overall, it seems like the distance is a little bit more, more likely to be invaded by an American. Low context, so what you say is that's what you mean, not the context. A little bit less likely to be deceptive or perhaps not entirely exact in their words, and low on ritualism. So there is less, bowing and whatever else is used to sort of rituals of communication. My story about self-promotion, again, it could be a matter of literally, who gets the job and who doesn't. When I was in Canada, I was at the University of Calgary, and one of the facilities that belongs now to campus is basically the remnants or some of the buildings that were built for the 1988 Olympics. And so one of those is basically a gymnastics center. And so twice a week, if I remember correctly, they had the gymnastics center open for amateurs like myself to do some gymnastics. And I'm not a gymnast, I could do little things like back tuck and maybe back and spring, but nothing super fancy. And so there were coaches there whose job was to basically make sure that we don't break our necks. So it was not a professional training, but basically people who were overseeing what we do there. And so it happened to be so that one of the coaches was a guy from Belarus, so from basically former Soviet Union. And so we got to know each other, and so kind of became befriended each other. And so he was complaining that he had a hard time finding a job, which was kind of strange because at that time, Calgary was booming. So we are talking about 2004, 2005. So the time when oil prices were going up daily, and when Calgary, as a sort of oil capital of Canada, if not of all North America, was doing extremely well. I mean, it was literally a very, very hot market, and it had more jobs than people. Normally people would find, start looking for a job in the morning and then, find the job by noon. And so this guy, he was an accountant and business owner in Belarus. Then he worked for a few years in Costa Rica, working for some American companies. And then eventually he not Costa Rica, Puerto Rico. And then relocated to Canada and got his CPA, all the certifications for the accounting, but couldn't find a job. And so he asked me to take a look at his resume and cover letter to see if I have some advice for him. And so the moment I saw his cover letter, I knew immediately what was the problem. So his cover letter read something like, I don't remember the exact words, but he was saying something like, well, I'm not the best worker and sometimes I make mistakes, but maybe I'll try my best, to be better for your job. And I was like, no, that's not how you write a cover letter in the United States. In the United States, people are very, very self-promoting, or Canada. In fact, you even have the websites with the list of so-called action words so that you can sort of pad up your job, your position in a way that it sounds more impressive. Like, for example, if you worked at McDonald's and you were flipping burgers, an American kid would not say that, I was in McDonald's flipping burgers. They would say something like, I was a manager of a meat processing facility and fully autonomously operated it for 2 months without any accidents. Meaning that basically for 2 months you were flipping burgers and you didn't burn yourself or something like that. So they are saying that in a much more assertive way, so to speak. And so again, in Russian, in Belarusian, kind of literature, the modesty is always valued. And so in all of the fairy tales, it's usually, the one who was most sort of modest or even self-effacing character, that's the one who kind of wins in the end. But when you try to be so modest and so self-effacing in, for example, a Canadian or American culture, then in many cases, people may judge you not as modest, but as lacking confidence or perhaps not being good for the job. And so you really have to change, how you present yourself, because it can be a matter of, who gets the job and who doesn't. So anyway, let me give you another example here. So here's another study that I will just show very quickly, but this one is by Peter Smith, one of the biggest names in our field. So he talks about a different type of communication style kind of categorization. So he talks about this sort of basically how strongly people express agreement, and how extreme they are in their judgments. And so when you look here at the first one, for example, collectivism, so people from collectivist cultures tend to be more agreeable in a sense, and are not, you know, don't have a propensity to extreme judgments or extreme statements. But when you go, for example, to masculinity, and I think we had also somewhere here down the line, so those people tend to be a little bit more assertive in their, you know, statements of, you know, when they make a statement, they tend to be more extreme. So they tend to overstate how good or how bad things are. Like if you think it's good, you say it's fantastic. And if you think it's bad, you say, oh, that's horrible, that's, you know, terrible. And again, so you don't need to remember all of these things, it's just to illustrate that sometimes there are differences depending on your cultural background. And so here is another one that also talks about some of the things here. Again, you can read the actual paper in the, yeah. But this is eventually what he kind of classifies countries or condenses countries to, so that four blocks. And so the United States, or in this case, there is no American sample in the study, but I assume that because Germany and the United Kingdom are here, that's where the United States would be, would be. So Americans tend to voice disagreement strongly, but not so much with agreement. So, but when you go, for example, to countries like Morocco or Iraq or Venezuela, so that's where people, if they agree, they say, oh, I agree so much. And when they disagree, they say, oh, I disagree so much. But then when you go to, for example, Asian countries, much more modest. So if they agree, they don't express it too overtly. And when they disagree, they also do not, oppose it too much. And so there was this very interesting study that showed how sometimes these things work. In the experiment, people were asked to write essentially a passage that would introduce you for a singles. In that case, the study was done before OkCupid or whatever the Match.com or whatever the websites are available now for meeting people. It was for a sort of a newspaper classified section, but I suppose it could be done the same way for the online dating sites. And so they asked people from different countries to introduce themselves. And again, when I teach this class face-to-face, and when there are people from different countries, I encourage them to take a pen and a pencil, paper, and write down a few sentences that describe them. And so what we see almost always is something like this, that people from Asia would be very modest in their evaluations. So they would be saying something like, oh, I'm not very good looking, but I'll be trying my best to be a good boyfriend, for example, or something like that. Whereas American singles ads almost always read more kind of in a self-promoting way, like a handsome, athletic male with a good sense of humor. So Americans are not shy to be self-promoting in that respect. Likewise, for example, when my mom, hosts guests over, again, she tends to be very modest. Like, when she serves food, she's always, oh, there is nothing special to offer you. So, sorry, it's not very delicious. I hope you will still like it. Things like that. So even though she spent a couple of days preparing the meal and it's a good meal. In the United States, people have a much easier time saying, oh, I cooked it, even though it's a cake that you just add some water and put it in the oven. People are much more comfortable being self-promoting. And as I said, it's we can kind of laugh about it, but it may be a difference between who gets the job and who doesn't, or who gets the contract and who doesn't, who gets the promotion and who doesn't. So kind of important things here. So there are some cross-cultural communication lessons in terms of, when you should speak up and when you should be a little bit more modest. You kind of can guess them from what we discussed. It's important to learn the working language, like it or not. It has nothing to do with one country being more discriminating than another. It's the same propensity in every country, in every culture. It's just the way our brain works. So remember that sometimes there is more to language than just words. So there is some communication, that is transmitted through things that are not the words themselves, but rather how those words were delivered. And there's one more thing that I wanted to mention, when it comes to emotions. It's not really a communication per se, but it is a form of communication, you can say. And so again, in different cultures, the expression of emotions in the workplace is accepted at a different level. So for example, in the West, in the United States, usually it's not common to express emotions and emotional attachment to people in the workplace. In fact, if you become too friendly with someone, it may, be perceived as nepotism or maybe even corruption. And in other cultures, it's completely the opposite. So it's perfectly fine to show favoritism to your coworkers. In fact, it would be perceived as wrong if you don't. And so there is this very interesting study that I saw that compared American versus Mexican employees. In one experiment, they were shown pictures of the work desk of different people. No person at the desk, just the picture of the work desk with what's on it. And so they they asked the participants to tell how they would rate the worker at this desk in terms of basically how good the worker is, the performance of the person. And so what they found was that there was a correlation in judgment based on how many personal items there was on that table, on that desk. So the more sort of non-work related items you could see, like, you know, like a picture of the family, like maybe a trophy from the last fishing trip, you know, things like that, the less people thought, or the more people thought that the person is not very professional. But the amount was very different for Mexico versus the United States. In the United States, usually when the percentage of all objects on the table exceeded about 20%, the people started judging the worker as not very competent and perhaps not very professional. In Mexico, the threshold was more like 50–60%. Even there, at some point when there are too many personal things, they would say, yeah, this worker maybe is not as reliable. But the threshold was much, much higher. So, but anyway, so I'm gonna stop here. And I just noticed there are a couple of questions somewhere there. So, oh no, they're just 6G, okay, got it. But any comments, any questions, any observations from you on cross-cultural communication differences and patterns? Anyone? When there are no questions, that can mean one of the two things. Either everything's clear, there is really nothing else to ask, thank you so much, good lecture, or nothing's clear, I'm completely lost, I have no idea what you just were talking about here. So hopefully it's the first one. So, but anyway, fascinating topic, and as I said, a lot of interesting things here. But let's talk a little bit about the exam. So we still have 2 weeks before the exam starts. It's going to be a Thursday of 2 weeks from now. So we will have this lecture, it's assigned for next week, and then the exam itself will open on Thursday and will stay open through the end of the day on Sunday. So you'll have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you can do it either time. On any of the days. So you can do it weekend or weekday as you wish. You will have 90 minutes to complete the exam once you start. You can start anytime, but you will have 90 minutes to complete the exam to start. There are 18 questions on the exam. 10 of them are multiple choice and 8 are short answer. And I will even show you a couple of those questions since you showed up for the lecture, or those who are watching, so you know what they look like. I don't even mind if you start preparing in advance. In fact, some of the questions you probably can guess. So there will be, for example, a question that asks you how culture is normally measured. So let me show you the question, the exam very quickly. So if I go to exams, where is the exams here? Assignments, I believe. So exam 1 here. So if I go, let me see if I can go to questions. I think I need to click edit and questions. So some questions will be very simple. Like, for example, this picture was used in one of the lectures to illustrate what? And you'll have 4 different options. If you watch the lecture, you will definitely know what that is. Or for example, based on the readings assigned in class, how much does culture predict, explain workplace behaviors? And you'll have 5 options, and you'll need to know that culture explains a fair bit, but not everything. The correlation is still relatively weak, but maybe stronger than for some types of predictors, but maybe weaker than, let's say, IQ. So things like that. And so you would have different, I'm not going to show you the options now here, but you know, there will be options. But then there will be also one like this, number 3, please describe in your own words how culture is measured in cross-cultural research. And so as you can see, these multiple choice questions, they are 4 points each, but the ones that are more kind of where you have to write a few sentences, they are a little bit more expensive, so 10 points each. And again, so all of them are common sense, and all of them were covered in lectures as well as readings, but it would be almost better to go through the lectures and slides, and so kind of refreshing your mind what we covered. In a few cases, the questions refer to the readings, but provide you some context. So even if you don't read the reading carefully, you will still understand what I'm trying to ask here. You will not need to remember any of the numbers, like I will not ask you what is the correlation between A and B, but you will, for example, need to remember some of the cultural dimensions. like individualism, collectivism, or maybe power distance. So there will be a question that will ask you to name a few of those. So things like that. For the short answer questions, normally I would expect almost like a bullet list, you know, like key points, don't write much. In fact, the less the better. And my strong preference is that you give me bullet lists, literally. Like if the question is how culture was measured, you would say something like a series of statements. You need to express your agreement or disagreement, usually using like a Likert type scale from 1 to 5. And then it would be averaged for each sample from each country. And that's how we basically make judgments. And maybe give a couple of examples or a couple of examples of the dimensions or questions. That's all I want. And so if you have those 4 or 5 bullet points, that's all we need. Yep, and you know, it's open books, open notes, obviously. So since it's take home, there is no way I can police and make sure that you're not using your books and notes. So for that reason, I assume that you will be using your books and notes. And I strongly recommend that you do, as well as that you refresh and review the slides right before the exam. So this way, if you don't know something, you at least know where to look for it and you can quickly find the answer. I think 1.5 hours is probably way too much, but because there are several open-ended questions, even though I don't expect you to write much, but I figured they probably will take a little more time. So I decided to give you a little bit time. And then, yep, I hope that all of you will get A's. In fact, you know, if you watch the video lectures, I cannot imagine that you will not know any of the answers. But, you know, we'll see. So some of you are not, or some of the students have not been attending the live video lectures. So if they don't watch the recordings, maybe they'll have some difficulties. But I'm sure they watch the lectures and, you know, they'll probably have no problems with the exam. So I'm not sure if I can say anything else about the exam. So it seems to be pretty straightforward. But if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Okay, no questions here too. So, all right, well then I guess we're gonna stop here. And thank you for being here on a short notice. And so you don't really need to do it. So those of you who attended the lecture today, so you basically covered the video lecture for the next week. All you have to do is just read, there are, I believe, 4 papers that you need to read, and then there will be a few short videos just, you know, to illustrate some of the points that you can also watch. And then, yeah, the exam will be 2 weeks from now, and we'll have the grades probably on Monday. Since it will be open-ended questions, at least some of them, and it will take me some time to read them. It may take me a day or 2 to grade them, but I'll try to have it by the end of the day on Monday. Okay, well, thank you so much, and have a nice weekend, and I'll see you, I guess, next week. Bye.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Goodbye.